The words hit Frances Monroe like a branding iron pressed flat against her chest, searing through every layer of armor she had built around herself over the past 3 brutal years in Caldwell, Kansas. She had not cried in front of anyone in this town. Not once. Not when they whispered about her in the dry goods store. Not when Reverend Thatch's wife had turned her back on Frances at the Sunday social. Not when the schoolchildren had repeated their parents' cruel words in the schoolyard, their small voices carrying the venom their mothers and fathers had carefully poured into them. She had not cried through any of it. But standing in the cool shadow of the stable doorway, with the late September wind carrying the smell of hay and leather, and something warm she could not quite name, Frances Monroe felt the walls she had so carefully mortared begin to crack. Graham Archer had not looked at her the way the other men in Caldwell looked at her. He had not looked at her with that mixture of hunger and contempt that she had come to recognize as the particular cruelty reserved for a woman without a husband, without a family name that carried weight, without anyone to defend her. He had looked at her the way a man looks at something he recognizes, something he has been searching for without knowing he was searching at all, and he had said it softly. That was the part that undid her. Not sharply, not with the practiced confidence of a man trying to impress a woman. Softly, like it cost him something to say it, like it was a truth he had been carrying alone for a long time and had finally decided she deserved to hear it. "You were never the problem," Graham Archer had said, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, his dark eyes holding hers without flinching. "Everyone in this town was." The crack in Frances Monroe's chest spread wide open. She had arrived in Caldwell in the spring of 1878, when the cattle drives were still flowing north along the Kishom Trail, and the town was loud and rough and full of the kind of men who believed the West was theirs by birthright. She had come by rail from St. Louis, carrying 2 trunks, a leather satchel, and a secret that she had no intention of sharing with anyone. She had a position secured as a seamstress at Mildred Dawson's dress shop on Main Street, a small room above the livery, arranged through a letter exchange, and the fierce, quiet determination of a woman who had survived enough to know that survival was only the beginning of what she was owed. Caldwell in 1878 was not a gentle place. The Texas drovers came through with their longhorns and their paydays and their rough appetites, and the town had grown up fast and mean around the commerce of cattle. There were 6 saloons, 2 churches, a schoolhouse that doubled as a courtroom, and a social hierarchy as rigid and unforgiving as anything Frances had left behind in St. Louis. The ranchers and their wives sat at the top of it. The merchants and their families occupied the middle. And then there were women like Frances Monroe, who arrived alone, without explanation, without connections, without a man's name attached to their own, and the town assigned them their place with ruthless efficiency. Mildred Dawson had been kind enough in the beginning. She was a practical woman in her late 40s who valued good stitchwork above social pedigree, and Frances's needlework was exceptional. But kindness in Caldwell had a shelf life, and it expired the moment the other women decided they had an opinion about you. The opinion about Frances Monroe had formed in under a week. It started with Clara Holt, the wife of the man who owned the largest cattle operation east of the Arkansas River, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue who had made it her particular mission to know every piece of information about every person in Caldwell before that person knew she was watching. Clara Holt had watched Frances Monroe walk down Main Street on her second day in town, had noted the quality of her dress, the absence of a wedding ring, the way Frances held her chin at a particular angle that some women read as pride and other women read as defiance, and had drawn her conclusions before Frances had reached the far end of the street. By the end of that first week, the conclusion had spread through every parlor and tea gathering in Caldwell like water finding every crack in a foundation. Frances Monroe was a woman with a past. The exact nature of that past was not specified, because it did not need to be. In a town like Caldwell in 1878, A woman alone with good looks and a straight spine and no explanation was a woman with a past, and that was sufficient. Frances had tried in the beginning. She had attended church. She had been polite at the mercantile. She had accepted an invitation to a quilting circle and had sat for 2 hours carefully stitching while the women around her spoke to each other and over her and through her as though she were a piece of furniture that had appeared without being ordered. She had gone home that evening, sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the room above the livery, and made a decision. She would not seek their approval. She would earn her living, keep her silence, and build a life from whatever materials were available to her in this hard, indifferent town. She had been doing exactly that for nearly 3 years when Graham Archer rode into Caldwell on a gray October morning, with 2 of his ranch hands behind him, a black horse under him that moved like smoke over water, and eyes the color of deep river water that swept the main street with the kind of attention that missed nothing. Frances had been in the doorway of Mildred's shop when he passed. She had noticed him the way you notice a change in weather before you can name what has shifted in the air. He was not the tallest man who had ever ridden down Main Street, not the most broadly built, not the most obviously striking. He was somewhere past 30, with dark hair that had the first silver threads at his temples, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red Kansas limestone that jutted out of the riverbank south of town. He wore his authority the way the landscape wore the sky, completely and without effort. He glanced toward the shop doorway and Frances had the brief, disorienting experience of making eye contact with someone who was actually looking at her rather than looking at the idea of her. Then he was past, and his ranch hands were past, and the street was ordinary again, and Frances had gone back inside to finish the hem she had been working on, and had thought very deliberately about nothing at all. She learned his name 2 days later when he came into the shop. He pulled the door open without hesitation, bringing the smell of the outdoors with him, and stood in the middle of Mildred's carefully arranged bolts of fabric and spools of thread, with the contained patience of a man, accustomed to environments more expansive than this one. Mildred was in the back and Frances was at the counter, and so she was the one who looked up from her work and said, in the neutral professional voice she had perfected for dealing with anyone in Caldwell, "Good morning. What can I help you with?" He had looked at her for just a moment longer than was strictly necessary before he answered, and the directness of it would have unsettled her if she had not long since made herself impossible to unsettle. "I need a shirt repaired," he said. "The left seam is giving out. It's the last good one I have that doesn't need the full collar replaced, and I've got a meeting with the county commissioner next week." "Leave it with me," Frances said. "I can have it ready by Friday." "I'm Graham Archer," he said, and the way he said it was not a boast. It was simply what he considered to be the necessary information for a business transaction. "I run the Double Arrow out past the creek crossing on the North Road." "I know of the Double Arrow," Frances said, which was true. The Double Arrow was one of the 3 largest cattle operations in the county, and its reputation was for quality stock and fair dealing, which in Caldwell in 1878 made it practically legendary. "Leave the shirt with me, and I'll have it ready Friday." He nodded. He pulled the shirt from where he had it folded under his arm, set it on the counter with the careful deliberateness of a man who respected what other people's workspaces, and said, "Thank you, miss," and waited. "Monroe," she said. "Frances Monroe." Something moved across his expression, fast enough that she nearly missed it. A recognition of the name, she thought. The recognition that every person in Caldwell had when they heard her name, the small recalibration of their expression that told her they had already been briefed by Clara Holt's invisible network. But what she saw in Graham Archer's expression was not the recalibration she expected. It was something more like recognition of a different kind, like hearing a word he had not expected to hear in a language he thought only he still spoke. "Thank you, Miss Monroe," he said, and he left. She repaired the shirt with the same precision she brought to everything she did, because precision was one of the things no one could take from her. She reinforced the entire seam rather than just the section that was failing, replaced 2 buttons that were about to follow the seam's example, and pressed the collar with the flat iron until it was exactly right. When Graham Archer came to collect it on Friday, he examined it with the same focused attention he seemed to bring to everything, then looked up and said, "This is better work than I asked for." "It's the same price I quoted," she said, which she realized too late might sound like a defense, but he shook his head slightly. "I'm not concerned about the price," he said. "I'm saying it's good work. You shouldn't have to defend good work." It was such a precise observation about the situation she was in that she did not know how to respond to it. So she told him the price, and he paid it without commentary and left. She stood at the counter for a moment after the door closed and felt something in her chest that she could not immediately identify. She identified it later, lying awake in the narrow bed above the livery, with the sound of the horses shifting below her and the wind working at the window frame. It was the feeling of being seen without being exposed. It was the feeling of a person looking at you and seeing a person. She was not accustomed to it, and it frightened her considerably. He came back 3 weeks later, not for a shirt this time, but with a commission from his housekeeper, a stout Mexican woman named Elena Vargas, who managed the Double Arrow's domestic operations with the iron competence of a general and the personal warmth of an actual human being, which made her unique in Francis's experience of the people connected to Caldwell's cattle ranches. The commission was for new curtains for the ranch house's main room, heavy practical ones that would keep out the winter draft. Graham Archer had taken the measurements himself and written them down in a hand that was exact and clean, and he presented the paper to Francis with the quiet efficiency of a man who did not waste either his time or other people's. "Elena wanted to come herself," he said, "but her daughter is visiting from Wichita and I didn't want to pull her away. I hope the measurements are sufficient." "They're very precise," Francis said, examining the paper. "This is good work." "You shouldn't have to defend good work." She had not planned to say it. She heard herself say it and felt a heat rise in her face that she fought down with everything she had, but when she made herself look up at him, Graham Archer was not smiling in the way that would have been mortifying. He was looking at her with that river water directness, and what she saw in his expression was not amusement at her expense. It was something that looked almost like relief. Like a man who had been in a room with people speaking a language he did not share, and had suddenly heard someone say something in his own tongue. "I'll take the measurements," she said, because she needed to say something professional, and she did not trust herself with anything that was not professional in that moment. "How long will the curtains take?" he asked. 2 weeks. I have other orders ahead of yours." "That's fine," he said. "There's no rush." He paused with the specific pause of a man deciding whether to say the next thing. "I've been in Caldwell for 3 days this time, waiting on the commissioner's reply about the water rights issue on the North Pasture. I eat at the hotel dining room in the evenings. If you're not otherwise engaged, Miss Monroe, I'd be glad of company at dinner." Frances Monroe had been eating alone for 3 years. She had been eating alone by choice, because the alternative was to accept invitations from the drovers who made their interest clear with the particular combination of confidence and contempt that told her exactly what kind of company they were looking for, or to wait for invitations from the respectable women of Caldwell that never came. She had made a complete peace with eating alone. She preferred it to the alternative. But this was not an invitation from a drover, and this was not an invitation weighted with any of the complicated condescension she had become expert at identifying. This was, as far as she could tell, simply a man who had noticed that she was a person and had decided to treat her accordingly. She studied him for a moment, watching for the hidden motive she had learned to look for in every offer of kindness in this town, the trap disguised as generosity, the dark intention wrapped in a reasonable request. She could not find it. "I eat at 6:30, she said. "So do I," he said, and the simplicity of it was the most disarming thing about him, and she had already identified at least 4 other things that were significantly disarming about Graham Archer, which was 4 more than she could afford. She spent the rest of that afternoon telling herself it was a business dinner, and that she should not read anything into it, and that she was perfectly capable of having a professional meal with a client, without any of the emotional machinery she could feel beginning to turn inside her doing anything dangerous. She was right about her capability, but wrong about the dinner being only a professional matter, because Graham Archer sat across from her in the hotel dining room and asked her about her work, genuinely asked, not in the way people asked about other people's work when they wanted to seem interested, but in the way that betrayed a real curiosity about the skill and thought involved. He asked how she had learned to sew, and she told him about her mother, who had been a dressmaker in St. Louis, and had started teaching Francis the craft before Francis was old enough to reach the sewing table without a stool. He listened without interrupting, which was its own unusual quality in a man. She asked him about the water rights dispute, because it was the kind of practical territory she felt safe in, and he explained the situation with the same precision he brought to everything else, a complicated tangle involving a neighboring rancher named Silas Brand, who had redirected a tributary creek 3 years ago in a way that interfered with the Double Arrow's northern pasture irrigation, and the county commissioner who had received enough of Silas Brand's money to make the dispute more complicated than it should have been. Brand is the kind of man, Graham said, in the tone of someone stating a fact rather than making a complaint, who believes that the law is something you purchase rather than something you follow. I know the type, Francis said. He looked at her with the directness she was beginning to expect, and she realized she had revealed something without intending to. But he did not push at it. He simply nodded slightly, with the particular courtesy of a man who knew when someone had said as much as they intended to say, and respected the boundary of it. She walked back to the room above the livery afterward in the thin October night air, with the stars very close and bright overhead in the way they got on the Kansas plains in autumn, and she allowed herself, very carefully and with significant internal warning labels, to notice that she had enjoyed herself, genuinely and fully enjoyed herself, in a way she had not experienced in Caldwell in 3 years and possibly longer. She woke the next morning to find that Clara Holt's invisible network had been operational and efficient. The first sign was the way Mildred Dawson greeted her when she came down for work, a fractional coolness in the usual morning warmth that Francis clocked immediately. The second sign was a visit from Eleanor Marsh, the postmaster's wife, who had never visited the shop before and came in under the pretense of inquiring about a winter coat fabric but whose real purpose became apparent within 2 minutes, when she said, in the particular tone of a woman performing concern while delivering judgment, "I understand you had dinner with Graham Archer last evening, Francis. I do hope you know what you're doing. He's a man of standing in this community, and some people might feel," and she left the sentence unfinished in the way that was meant to communicate that the unfinished portion was more damning than anything she could actually say. Francis had heard variations of this speech for 3 years. She set down the fabric sample she was holding, looked at Eleanor Marsh with the complete steadiness she had built through years of practice, and said, "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Marsh. Was there a coat fabric you wanted to look at?" Eleanor Marsh left without ordering anything, which was fine. What was not fine was the conversation Francis had with Mildred Dawson that afternoon, when Mildred, with the apologetic discomfort of a woman who was genuinely kind, but not quite brave enough to prioritize someone else's dignity over her own social position, explained that she had heard from several customers that Francis's presence in the shop had become a source of concern for some of the town's more prominent families. And perhaps it would be better if Francis worked primarily in the back room rather than at the counter. "It's not that I have any personal objection," Mildred said, with the misery of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and could not quite make herself not do it. It's just that the business is affected when—" "I understand," Frances said, and she did understand, which was the terrible part. She understood completely, and understanding it did not make it hurt less. It made it hurt differently, with the particular edge of something that had been a betrayal she had not quite allowed herself to see coming. She spent the rest of that day in the back room, doing the curtain work for the Double Arrow, and she let herself feel the anger of it because the anger was cleaner than the grief underneath it. The anger was something she could work with. The grief was the part that had a face on it, and that face was her own, 3 years younger, standing on a train platform in St. Louis with 2 trunks and a leather satchel, and the absolute certainty that if she could just get far enough from the source of the original damage, she could build something that was wholly hers and would be safe from the particular cruelty of people who make decisions about who a woman is before they have spent 5 minutes in her presence. That evening, Graham Archer appeared at the back door of the dress shop. She had not expected him. She opened the door and looked at him in the long rectangle of pale golden evening light, and he said without preamble, "I heard about the conversation with Mrs. Marsh." "Word travels fast," Frances said. "In Caldwell it always does," he said. "I want you to know I'm sorry. It wouldn't have happened without the dinner yesterday evening." "I make my own choices," Frances said with some heat. "You don't need to apologize for an invitation I accepted." "I'm not apologizing for the invitation," he said. "I'm saying I know this town, and I know what it does to people it decides to make targets, and I should have thought about what the company of a rancher meant in terms of the attention it would bring to you." She looked at him for a long moment. The anger was still there, but it was adjusting its direction, the way a compass adjusts when the true north it was pointing toward turns out to be where it already was. "Come in," she said. "The curtains are nearly done." He came in and stood in the small back room among the bolts of fabric and the smell of hot iron, and looked at the curtains she had been working on, spread across the cutting table in their near-completed state. He looked at them the way he looked at the shirt, with the focused respect of a man who understood that quality in a craft was not incidental but intentional. "These are good," he said. "Thank you," she said, without qualification. He stayed for an hour. They talked about the water rights case, which had developed a new complication, and about the Double Arrow's plans for the coming spring season, and about a book she had on the workroom shelf, a well-worn copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch, which he recognized and which led to a 20-minute conversation about the nature of ambition and circumstance that Frances had not expected to be having in Caldwell with anyone, least of all a cattle rancher with silver threads in his dark hair. When he left, she stood in the doorway of the back room and watched the last of the October light leave the alley outside, and told herself very firmly that she was not falling in love with Graham Archer, and that she needed to be very careful because the consequences of falling in love with Graham Archer were something she could not afford. She was right about the consequences. She had not properly calculated how inadequate her defenses were. Over the next several weeks, Graham Archer found reasons to be in Caldwell more frequently than his business with the county commissioner strictly required. He brought more work to the shop, and he always delivered it himself rather than sending a hand, and he always seemed to arrive at the end of the working day. He took her to dinner twice more, and both times Frances was aware of the eyes tracking them through the dining room, and both times she made the deliberate choice to hold herself straight and meet every glance directly and give nothing away. She was not going to hide, and she was not going to apologize, and she was not going to make herself smaller to accommodate the judgment of people who had decided who she was before they had taken the time to actually look. Graham Archer did not look at her with judgment. He looked at her with the kind of attention that was a form of respect. He asked about her life in St. Louis, and she told him a version of it that was true but not complete, and he did not press for the completion. He was patient the way the plains were patient, quietly and without drama, but absolutely and without end. She found it both frightening and deeply restful, which was its own complicated emotional territory. She told him about her mother's death 4 years ago, the illness that had come fast and taken everything, and the discovery afterward that the life Frances had believed she was part of innocent. Louis had been, in significant ways, constructed on premises that turned out to be other people's fictions rather than anything she had agreed to. She did not elaborate on this. He listened, and then he said something that she found herself turning over in her mind for days afterward. He said, "People who build their lives on other people's silence are always surprised when the silence ends." She had looked at him sharply, searching for any indication that he knew more than she had told him. But his expression was only the usual directness, the river water steadiness, and she understood that he had simply said a true thing without knowing quite how precisely it applied to her specific situation. He had a gift for that, she was learning. A gift for truth that was not cruel because it was not aimed. It was simply what he saw, stated plainly, offered without agenda. She told him about the secret in early December, 6 weeks after they had first had dinner together, and she told him because she had been about to be beaten to it. She had seen Silas Brand in the Mercantile that afternoon. Silas Brand, who was fat and red-faced and smelled of whiskey at 3 in the afternoon, and who had connections to St. Louis going back a decade through the cattle brokerage business. Silas Brand had looked at her across the dry goods counter with a smile that was a threat wearing a social expression, and said, loudly enough for the 2 other customers to hear, "Miss Monroe, I had a very interesting conversation with a business associate of mine from St. Louis last week, Cornelius Whitfield. I believe you know the name." Frances had felt the cold of it go through her like winter water. She had kept her expression flat, paid for her flour and her thread, and walked out without responding to him. She had gone to the stable at the north end of town because she knew Graham Archer's horse was there. She had not planned what she was going to say. She only knew that if Silas Brand was going to use the information as a weapon, she needed Graham Archer to have it first from her own mouth, shaped by her own words, because whatever happened after that at least would not contain the particular betrayal of him hearing her secrets as ammunition from someone who hated them both. She found him in the stable doorway, exactly as she had found him in the flash of the present moment that had opened this story, and the words came out in a rush, steady and direct, and not quite steady. She told him about Cornelius Whitfield. She told him that she had worked for Whitfield's household in St. Louis as a seamstress, that she had been his wife Harriet's personal dressmaker, that Cornelius Whitfield had used his position and power to create a situation where Frances had been placed in an impossible circumstance that was not of her making, that she had refused to be what he wanted her to be, and that he had destroyed her reputation in St. Louis with the efficiency of a man who had the social machinery to do so. She told him that she had left St. Louis because staying was not survivable, and that she had come to Caldwell to start again, and that Caldwell had been willing to repeat the verdict of St. Louis without any of the original evidence, simply because she was a woman alone, and that was sufficient. She told it all in one long, clear statement, the way she had rehearsed it in her mind without knowing she was rehearsing it. And when she finished, she was standing in the stable doorway with the September wind moving through the straw-yellow grass visible through the far side of the building, and she was watching Graham Archer's face the way you watch the horizon when you are trying to determine what kind of weather is coming. The weather that came was not what she had prepared for, because what Graham Archer did was look at her for a long, still moment with his dark eyes holding hers, and then he said it, softly, like it cost him something. Like it was the most important thing he had said in years. "You were never the problem," he said. "Everyone in this town was." And Frances Monroe, who had not cried in front of anyone in Caldwell in 3 years, put both hands over her mouth and felt the tears come anyway. He did not touch her. He understood, with the particular intelligence of a man who actually paid attention to people, that she needed a moment with the feeling before anything else could happen. He stood at a careful, respectful distance and simply remained, which was itself a form of shelter. She pressed her hands against her mouth and breathed through it, and when she looked up at him again she had herself in hand mostly, and she said, "I didn't come here expecting sympathy." "I know," he said. "That's not what I'm offering." "What are you offering?" she asked, because precision mattered when you had been burned before. "Truth," he said simply. "And the fact of it doesn't change what I think of you." She took a breath. The late afternoon light was falling at a long angle through the stable, turning the dust motes gold, and Graham Archer was standing in it with the kind of patient certainty that she had spent 3 years needing without knowing she was needing it. "What do you think of me?" she asked, because she needed to hear him say it. "I think you're the most capable, precise, and honestly intelligent person I've encountered in this county," he said. "I think the town's opinion of you reflects the town's character, not yours. I think you came here and built something real out of materials that were deliberately inadequate, and I think that says everything about who you are." He paused, with the pause that she had learned preceded the thing he was about to say that mattered most. "And I think I'd like to keep your company if you'll allow it. Not as a client, not as a neighbor, as something more than that if you're willing." Francis Monroe looked at Graham Archer in the gold-dusted late afternoon of a Caldwell stable in December of 1878 and made a decision. She made it the way she made all her serious decisions, with full attention and without flinching, and she said, "Yes." What followed was not simple, because nothing involving Francis Monroe and Caldwell, Kansas had ever been simple. Silas Brand moved forward with his plan, because Silas Brand was the kind of man who did not abandon a strategy simply because it was cruel. He mentioned Cornelius Whitfield's name at the next county commissioners' meeting, where Graham Archer was present to argue the water rights case. He mentioned it with the particular precision of a man who had been saving the information for exactly this moment, when it would cause the maximum disruption to the maximum number of things Graham Archer cared about. Graham Archer listened to Silas Brand describe, in the public forum of the commissioners' meeting, a version of Francis Monroe's history that was both partially accurate and catastrophically misleading, constructed to do the maximum possible damage while maintaining the thin technical defense of not being an outright lie. He listened to it without expression, which several men in the room later described as terrifying. When Brand finished, Graham Archer stood up and said, in a voice that carried the quiet authority of a man who did not need volume to command a room, "Every word of what Brand just said about Miss Monroe is a deliberate misrepresentation of a situation in which she was wronged by a man who used his power against her. If anyone in this room repeats his version of events, they can expect to discuss it with me directly." It was not a threat, technically. It was a statement of intent. But the room heard it the way a room hears something that has the full weight of the person behind it, and the silence afterward was the silence of a judgment being reconsidered. Silas Brand, who did not know when to stop, pushed it further. He came to Mildred Dawson's shop 2 days later, while Francis was at the counter. He came in with 2 of his friends, men who were not quite his equals in social standing, but were equals in the particular entertainment of making other people smaller, and he said to Francis, directly, with a smile that was a threat, "I suppose you think the Archer man will protect you. Men like him always believe they can fix things. They get tired of it eventually." Francis Monroe looked at Silas Brand across the counter of Mildred Dawson's dress shop and felt something clarify inside her that had been complicated for a long time. She was not afraid of him. She had not been afraid of him in the mercantile, and she was not afraid of him now. What she felt was a clean, clear anger, the kind that is the opposite of fear, and she said, "I have never required anyone's protection, Mr. Brand. I require only to be left alone to live my life without being made the object of other people's entertainment. If you have nothing to purchase, please leave my place of employment." Silas Brand blinked. The 2 men with him shifted slightly. Whatever they had expected from Francis Monroe, it had not been this particular quality of stillness. Brand started to say something else, but the door of the shop opened behind him and Graham Archer walked in with the timing of a man who had been watching from across the street, and Brand took one look at Graham's expression, and decided that whatever he had been about to say was not worth the immediate consequences. He left. His friends left. Mildred Dawson stood in the doorway to the back room with her hands clasped, and her expression a complicated mixture of guilt and relief. Graham Archer looked at Frances. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I was handling it." "I know," he said. "I wasn't going to intervene unless you wanted it." "You were watching from across the street," she said. "Yes," he said without any apology for it. She considered this for a moment. The distinction between surveillance and protection was real, and she understood it, and she understood that he had drawn the line in exactly the right place, which was the place she would have drawn it herself if she had been the one doing the watching. "Thank you," she said, "for waiting to be needed. That's the only kind of help worth giving," he said. She looked at him, this man who kept showing up and kept getting it right in ways she had stopped expecting from anyone, and she said quietly, so Mildred would not hear from the back room, "Come for dinner this evening. At my place. I'll cook." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him understanding the weight of the offer. Not just the practical warmth of a home-cooked meal, but the significance of an invitation into her actual life rather than the public professional space of a hotel dining room. "I'll be there at 6:30, he said. She went back to work after he left, and Mildred came forward from the back room with the expression of a woman preparing to say something she had been composing for several days. "Frances," she said, "I owe you an apology. The conversation we had several weeks ago about working in the back room, I was wrong to say what I said, and I was a coward not to have said this sooner." Frances looked at Mildred Dawson, who was genuinely kind and genuinely fallible in the way of most genuinely kind people, who fold under social pressure and then feel the guilt of it long after the pressure has passed. "I accept the apology," Frances said, because she did. "And I'd like to come back to the counter." "Yes," Mildred said, with relief that was almost comic in its intensity. "Please." Frances Monroe returned to the counter that afternoon. No one came in and said anything about it, but two women who had previously been in the habit of looking through her when they entered the shop made actual eye contact with her, which was not forgiveness but was something in the direction of it. She did not need their forgiveness. But she noted the direction as a fact about what was shifting in the landscape of Caldwell, the way you note a shift in the wind before you know what weather it is carrying. Graham Archer came to dinner that evening at 6:30, exactly as he had said he would. Frances had cooked a beef stew with the last of the autumn vegetables from the small kitchen garden she kept behind the livery, and there was bread she had made that morning, and she had taken considerable care with the setting of the small table in her room, not because she needed to impress him, but because she was a person who took care with the things that mattered. He brought wine, a bottle of Madeira that he said Alina had been keeping in the ranch house cellar for a special occasion, and had sent along with her blessing when he had mentioned where he was going. "Alina told me to tell you," he said, setting it on the table, "that she loves the curtains and that anyone who can sew like that is welcome at the Double Arrow any time." Frances smiled, and she felt the smile come from somewhere real rather than somewhere performed, which was still a slightly startling sensation. "Tell Alina I'm glad she likes them." They ate dinner at the small table with the lamp between them, and the conversation moved easily through everything, and nothing in the way that conversation moves between people who have found the particular frequency at which they understand each other. He told her about the Double Arrow, about how he had built it over 8 years, from a modest spread that his father had left him into something that was genuinely his own, shaped by his choices and his work, and his particular vision of what a cattle operation should be. He spoke about it with the same quiet pride that she recognized from her own feelings about her work, the satisfaction of something built with your own hands and your own skill from materials that required skill to work with. She told him about St. Louis. She told him the whole of it, not the edited version she had given him in the stable, but the full version, with all the details she had kept contained for 3 years, because there had been no one in Caldwell safe enough to tell. She told him about the Whitfield household, about the way Cornelius Whitfield had used his wealth and his social position to construct a situation that was designed to be inescapable, about the way his wife Harriet had known and had looked away, about the way every person Frances had thought was her ally had evaporated when the pressure of Whitfield's influence was applied. She told him about the long months after, the social destruction that had been so thorough she could not find work in St. Louis, the decision to leave, the train east and then west to Kansas, the satchel and the trunks and the absolute determination to build something that was not vulnerable to someone else's power over her. Graham Archer listened to all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, with the stew cooling in its bowl and the Madeira dark in the glasses between them. Then he said, "I had my own version of a trap, not the same. Mine was a marriage. She had not expected this. She waited." He told her about a woman named Catherine Pryor, whom he had married at 23, when the double arrow was still a struggling operation, and he was still believing that the people closest to you were the people safest to trust. He told it the way Frances had told her own story, with precision and without self-pity, which was its own form of courage. Catherine had been beautiful and charming and had married him for what she believed was coming, which was wealth. And when the wealth was slower in arriving than she had expected, and the life of a ranch wife was harder, she had made choices that amounted to a betrayal in the most direct sense of the word, choices that involved a cattle broker from Wichita and the Double Arrows account books. The marriage had ended with a divorce that had cost Graham almost as much as the damage Catherine had done to the accounts, and had left him with a mistrust of his own judgment about people that had hardened into a general reserve that most people in Caldwell interpreted as arrogance, but was actually the scar tissue over something that had genuinely hurt. Frances listened to all of it. When he finished, she looked at him across the small table in the lamplight and said, "We've both been burned by people who used us as instruments for their own ends." "Yes," he said. "And we've both spent time afterward being very careful," she said. "Yes," he said again. "I'm still being careful," she said. "I need you to know that I'm not," she looked for the right word. "I'm not reckless. About this. About you. I feel very strongly about you, and it frightens me because I have excellent reasons to be frightened, and I need you to understand that me saying yes to you is not a small thing for me." "It's not a small thing for me either," Graham Archer said. "I spent years after Catherine deciding that I didn't have the capacity for this kind of thing. I told myself I was protecting people from me, which was a more comfortable story than that I was protecting myself from being hurt again." He looked at the Madeira glass, turned it once in his fingers, looked back at her. "Then you came to the shop counter and told me my shirt work was good and I shouldn't have to defend it, and something I had decided was closed turned out to still be open." Frances Monroe looked at Graham Archer across the small table, with the lamp burning between them and the December wind working at the window above the livery and the horses shifting quietly below them, and said, "I'm glad it was still open." He reached across the table and set his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they stayed like that for a long, quiet moment that contained more honesty than either of them had risked with another person in years. Silas Brand's water rights case was resolved in January, when Graham Archer, in partnership with a Wichita attorney named Harrison Cole, who had a particular gift for exposing the kind of legal corruption that Silas Brand had been practicing for the better part of a decade, presented evidence to the county commissioner that was sufficiently detailed and damning that the commissioner's willingness to side with Brand evaporated in direct proportion to the visibility of his potential legal exposure. The tributary creek was ordered restored to its original course, the Double Arrows North Pasture irrigation was restored, and Silas Brand received a formal censure from the county board that was publicly recorded and widely discussed. Brand attempted to retaliate by repeating the Frances Monroe story to anyone who would listen, but the audience for it had changed. People who had been willing to accept the story when it was Brand's word against a woman. No one knew had become more cautious now that the source of the story had been publicly identified as a man who had been caught corrupting the county government. The story did not disappear, because stories about women like Frances Monroe in towns like Caldwell never completely disappeared, but it lost the unanimous social authority it had previously carried, and that was something. Clara Holt made the first public gesture of recalibration in early February, which Frances interpreted accurately as evidence that Clara had determined which direction the social wind was blowing, and was repositioning accordingly rather than any genuine change of character. Clara came into the shop and ordered a dress for spring, and spoke to Frances at the counter with the particular performance of warmth that very cold people produce when they have decided warmth is strategic. Frances served her with complete professionalism and charged her the standard rate and thought very little of Clara Holt's opinion in any direction. The thing that mattered to Frances in February of 1879 was Graham Archer, who was in Caldwell for a full week because the spring cattle season preparations required his attention to some supply agreements with the mercantile, and who spent every evening of that week with Frances. They walked along the frozen Arkansas riverbank on the Sunday afternoon, and he held her hand in the particular way he had of holding it, firmly and without drama, and she talked about what she wanted for the future, and he listened, and then told her what he wanted, and there was a significant amount of overlap in the lists that she found both startling and right. "I don't want to be in Caldwell my whole life," she said, on the riverbank with the ice in the shallows and the sky very gray and close overhead. "I want to be somewhere that is mine, that I've chosen." "The Double Arrow is north of Caldwell," he said. "It's outside the town's social machinery. It's its own place." She looked at him. She understood what he was saying. "You're saying something quite large," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm saying it carefully." "You want me to come to the Double Arrow," she said. "I want you to be at the Double Arrow," he said with the precision that she had come to recognize as his form of love, the care with words that reflected the care with people. "If you'll have me, all of it, permanently." Frances Monroe stood on the frozen riverbank in February of 1879, with the Kansas sky pressing down, and the man she had somehow managed to fall in love with in the exact middle of her most carefully defended period of independence standing beside her with his hand in hers, and she said, "I'll need to think about it." "Take whatever time you need," he said, without any performance of patience because the patience was real. She thought about it for 3 days, which was not because she was uncertain about Graham Archer. She was not uncertain about him at all, which was itself part of what she was thinking about, the disorienting experience of not being uncertain about someone, of finding that the machinery she had built to detect hidden motives and traps and dark intentions had run on Graham Archer for months and come back empty every time. She was thinking about the difference between being someone who survived and being someone who chose. She had survived St. Louis. She had survived Caldwell. She did not want to only survive the next thing. She wanted to choose it. She went to the Double Arrow on the 3rd day, riding out on the hired horse she used for the occasional delivery, and arrived at a ranch that was exactly what she had expected from a man like Graham Archer, well-built and unpretentious and very precisely maintained, with a ranch house that was larger than it needed to be for one man, and a set of outbuildings that told the story of 8 years of steady building. Elena Vargas came out to meet her with the energy of a woman who had been wanting to do exactly this and said, in accented English that was warm and direct, "You are Frances Monroe. I hung those curtains myself. Come in and have coffee." Frances sat in the main room of the Double Arrow ranch house with Elena's excellent coffee and looked at the curtains she had made hanging in the windows, heavy and good against the February draft, and felt something settle in her chest. This was a place that had her work in it. This was a place that had Elena Vargas in it, who was already telling Frances about the spring garden she was planning, and the particular variety of chilies she had been trying to grow for 4 years that kept failing in the Kansas winters, but which she was determined to eventually make succeed. This was a place that was full of the kind of real life that was not constructed for appearances, but was simply lived by people going about their actual existences. Graham Archer came in from the north pasture an hour after Frances arrived, tracked with mud and smelling of cold air and horses, and stopped when he saw her sitting at his kitchen table with Alina's coffee mug in her hand. He looked at her with the question clear in his face, and she looked back at him with the answer equally clear in hers. "Yes," she said, the same word she had said in the stable, but this time it was bigger and they both knew it. The wedding was in April of 1879, at the Double Arrow rather than in town, which was a decision that pleased Frances considerably, and which surprised several people who had expected them to use the church. Reverend Thatch performed the ceremony, because he was the only reverend available, and because Graham Archer had informed him, with the polite certainty that was the Graham Archer method of communication, that he expected the service to be conducted with the same dignity that it would be conducted with for any couple in the county, and that the Reverend's personal opinions about any aspect of the situation were not part of the arrangement. Reverend Thatch, who was not a brave man but was a man capable of reading a room, had agreed. Alina Vargas made tamales for the reception, and the ranch hands and their families came, and a few people from Caldwell came, including Mildred Dawson, who cried in the genuine way of someone who feels the full weight of what they are witnessing and is glad to be there. Frances wore a dress she had made herself, cream-colored wool with a fitted waist, and a collar she had taken considerable time with, and she walked across the spring-green grass of the Double Arrow's front pasture toward Graham Archer with the particular combination of certainty and full feeling that she had learned to stop being afraid of. Graham Archer, standing in the April sunshine waiting for her, looked at her with the expression she had come to know as his most private one, the one that was not for public consumption, but for her specifically, the one that said that whatever dark and defended period he had carried himself through was over and he had arrived somewhere better. He looked at her like that, and she reached him and took his hands, and Reverend Thatch said the words, and they said the words back, and it was a marriage. The first year on the Double Arrow was the kind of year that resets your understanding of what your life is capable of being. Frances brought her workroom to the Double Arrow, setting it up in a room off the main house that had good light from the south windows, and she continued her work both for clients in Caldwell who found the quality of her work sufficient to justify riding out to the ranch, and increasingly for the broader county, because word spread in the way that good work's reputation spreads, and by the end of the year she had more commissions than she could reasonably manage alone. Alina Vargas had a daughter-in-law who was a quick learner with a needle, and Frances took her on as an apprentice, which was the beginning of something that Frances had not previously imagined herself doing, which was teaching. She and Graham worked the Double Arrow together in the sense that she was fully part of its life and its decisions, not because he needed her business judgment, which was not her primary skill, but because he wanted her there and she wanted to be there, and the ranch was large enough to hold many different kinds of work. She sat at the desk with him on the evenings when he was working through the account books, and sometimes she caught an error he had missed, and he received this without any of the defensive fragility she had encountered in other men when their errors were identified. He simply corrected it, thanked her, and moved on. This was so unremarkable to him and so remarkable to her that she noted it the first time it happened, and by the fifth time she had stopped noting it because it was simply the way things were. They found out she was expecting a child in the summer of 1879, 3 months after the wedding, and the feeling of it was so complex and layered that Frances spent 2 days unable to fully organize it before she told Graham. She told him at the end of one of the long summer evenings, sitting on the porch of the Double Arrow with the Kansas sky going dark purple and the nighthawks calling above the pasture, and his reaction was to be very still for a moment and then to look at her with an expression that was so full of something that she could not immediately name that she almost looked away. She did not look away. "Are you glad?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I'm also frightened." "So am I," he said, and she loved him additionally for that. The baby was born in February of 1880 in the Double Arrow Ranch house with Alina Vargas and a midwife from the nearest neighboring ranch in attendance and Graham Archer in the next room, where Francis had sent him because she needed the space to do this work without managing his anxiety in addition to everything else. And Alina brought him in when it was over and put his son in his arms, and Graham Archer held the child with the careful certainty of a man who understood immediately that this was the most important thing he had ever held, and looked at Francis over the baby's head with his eyes full and his expression broken open in the best possible way. They named him Samuel James Archer, after Graham's father and Francis's grandfather, which satisfied both of them. The next several years at the Double Arrow were years of building, in every sense. Samuel grew from an infant to a toddler to a small, determined boy who was already showing the particular combination of his mother's precision and his father's patience that was going to make him someone to reckon with. The ranch expanded under Graham's steady management, with 2 additional pastures brought under rotation and a partnership arrangement with a neighboring ranch that benefited both operations. Francis's workroom became a proper business, with 2 full-time apprentices and a reputation that reached well beyond Caldwell and the surrounding county, into Wichita and further, because the quality of her work was uncompromising, and that was the kind of reputation that built itself. Alina Vargas's garden eventually produced the chilies she had been attempting for years, with a small adjustment to the planting schedule that Francis suggested after reading an agricultural report in a Kansas City newspaper. And Alina made a sauce from them that became a staple of every meal at the Double Arrow, and which Alina generously described as Francis's contribution to the ranch's culinary life, which Francis accepted with the warmth of genuine friendship, because by that point she and Alina were genuinely friends in the full sense of the word. The social landscape of Caldwell shifted further over those years, as social landscapes shift under the pressure of time and the slow accumulation of evidence that contradicts the original verdict. Women who had participated in the original judgment of Frances Monroe found themselves interacting with her at a distance, and then at closer range, some out of social strategy and some out of genuine reconsideration, and some simply because she was a presence in the county that could not be avoided if you needed the best seamstress between Caldwell and Wichita. Frances treated all of them with the professional courtesy she brought to everyone, because she had made her peace with the people of Caldwell, and that peace was not contingent on their apology. She did receive one apology that she had not expected, and that meant something. Mildred Dawson came to the Double Arrow in the spring of 1881 to place an order for a summer dress, and stayed for tea, and said, after they had talked about the order and about Samuel, who had been introduced as a courtesy, and who had investigated Mildred's button bag with scientific seriousness before being retrieved by Alina, that she wanted to say something she should have said much earlier. She said that she had been wrong to ask Francis to work in the back room, that it had been an act of cowardice that had caused Francis harm, and that she was sorry for it not as a social formality, but because it had genuinely troubled her conscience for 3 years and she wanted to say it directly. Francis looked at Mildred Dawson across her kitchen table and said, "I know you were afraid. I was afraid too, for a long time. I forgave you well before this." She paused, and then said the thing she had not quite said before, which was true, and which she thought Mildred deserved to hear. "You were one of the few people in Caldwell who treated me as a person in the beginning. I haven't forgotten that." Mildred Dawson went home with her dress order placed and her conscience somewhat lighter, and Frances went back to her workroom and sat for a moment in the good south window light before picking up the fabric she was working with, and thought about how things resolve themselves over time if you survive the period when they are unresolved. Not always and not for everyone. She knew that. The injustice that Cornelius Whitfield had committed against her in St. Louis had not been rectified, and the social system that made it possible for a man like Whitfield to destroy a woman's reputation with impunity and no consequence to himself was still fully intact. The injustice that Caldwell had done her was still an injustice, even if some of the people who had participated in it had recalibrated. She knew this, and she thought it was important to know it, not because she wanted to carry it as a weight, but because a true accounting of the world was better than a false peace with it. But she also knew, sitting in the workroom with the light falling clean and warm through the south windows, and the sound of Samuel in the yard below learning to navigate some complicated negotiation with one of the ranch hand's children, that she had what she had come west to find. Something that was hers. Something built on her own terms and her own work, in partnership with a man who had seen her clearly from the beginning, and had offered her truth instead of sympathy, and had meant what he said and been what he promised. That evening at dinner, Graham was reading a letter from Harrison Cole, the Wichita attorney who had become something like a friend through the process of the water rights case, and he looked up and said, "Cole is taking on a case in Topeka that involves a woman dispossessed of her property by her late husband's brother, who is claiming the husband's debts in a way that Cole believes is fraudulent. He's asking if I know anyone with experience navigating that kind of legal situation." He set the letter down. "I thought of you, actually, not the legal part, but the experience of having your circumstances deliberately misrepresented to remove your options." Francis looked at him. "You want me to speak to this woman? If you're willing," he said. Cole thinks testimony from someone who has been through a similar situation and come out the other side might be useful to her, not for the court case necessarily, but for her confidence in fighting it. Francis thought about this for a moment. 3 years ago, she would have said that the last thing she wanted to do was put herself in a position where her history was part of a public record again. But 3 years ago was not now, and she was not the same woman who had ridden into Caldwell with 2 trunks and a satchel and a secret she was protecting. "Write to Cole," she said. "Tell him I'll speak to her if she wants to speak to me." Graham looked at her with the expression she loved best on him, the one that was simply approval, clean and unperformed. "Good," he said. Samuel Archer was 4 years old in the winter of 1884, and he had opinions about everything, including the management of horses, and the correct way to fold napkins, and the specific injustice of being required to eat his supper before being allowed to look at his father's cattle ledger. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's precise gray eyes, and an entirely original character that owed something to both of them and a great deal to something that was entirely his own. He had also, in the past several months, developed the habit of referring to Elena Vargas as Abuela, which Elena received with the full warmth of someone who had been waiting for it, and which told Francis something true about how the double arrow had become in the years since she had made it her home. Francis found out she was expecting a second child in early spring of 1884, and this time there was less complexity in the feeling, simply the warmth of something that was very welcome. She told Graham in the workroom one afternoon when he had come in to show her a letter about a new cattle contract, and he put the letter on the workroom table and crossed to her and held her with the particular quality of his embrace that she had spent 5 years learning the vocabulary of, firm and close and without any performance, simply real. "Good," he said into her hair. "That is your response to everything," she said. "When something is good, it's good," he said. "There's no better word." The second baby was born in October of 1884, at the Double Arrow, with Elena present again, and the new midwife from Caldwell who had replaced the previous one. It was a girl, and they named her Clara. Not after Clara Holt, which was a coincidence of timing and family name that Francis found mildly amusing, but after Francis's Aunt Clara in Memphis, who had been one of the few people in Frances's extended family who had consistently treated her with uncomplicated kindness. Graham had not objected to the name, had in fact suggested it when Frances was uncertain, because he knew the story of Aunt Clara in Memphis and understood why the name was a good one. Little Clara Archer was, from her first weeks, a person of forceful and direct personality who made her preferences known with the efficiency of someone who had no time for ambiguity. She took after her mother in several specific ways that Graham found deeply amusing and Frances found occasionally alarming. By the time Clara was 2, she was already following her brother Samuel around the ranch, with the determination of a person who intends to be included in whatever is happening. And Samuel, to his considerable credit, let her. In the summer of 1885, Frances rode into Caldwell for a fitting appointment with a new client, a young woman who had recently arrived by rail from Kansas City, and who had found her way to Frances's reputation through a network of recommendations that spoke well of how far that reputation had traveled. The young woman's name was Helen Graves, and she was 22, and she had come to Caldwell to marry a man she had met through correspondence, and the man had met her at the station, and she had known within the first hour of arriving that she had made a significant error in judgment about him, and she was now in Caldwell without resources and without any plan beyond the immediate need for work. Frances recognized something in Helen Graves that she was familiar with from the inside, the combination of straight spine and careful expression that was the external architecture of someone who had decided that dignity was the one thing they could maintain regardless of circumstances. She took Helen on as an apprentice in the workroom, which had room for another pair of skilled hands, and offered her the practical option of boarding at the Double Arrow until she had established herself sufficiently to make her own arrangements. Graham, informed of this plan at dinner, said good, in the way that meant he had already expected something like it. Helen Graves boarded at the Double Arrow for 8 months, which was enough time for her to become a skilled and reliable part of the workroom, and also enough time for her to meet, on one of her trips to Caldwell, a young telegraph operator named Arthur Pitts who was 24 and extremely earnest, and who was nothing like the man she had come to Caldwell expecting to marry, which was entirely the recommendation for him. Frances watched this develop over the 8 months with the particular attention of someone who had spent a long time reading the real dynamics between people. And when Arthur Pitts appeared at the Double Arrow one Saturday afternoon to ask Graham Archer's opinion on the wisdom of proposing to Helen Graves, Frances appeared in the doorway of the study where Graham was already doing his best to be usefully advisory and said, "Ask her. She wants you too." Arthur Pitts looked at Frances Monroe Archer with the expression of a young man who has just been given permission by an authority he trusts and left at speed, and the proposal happened that afternoon by the telegraph office and was accepted. The years rolled on the way years do on a working ranch in Kansas, not gently but with the fullness of real life that contains everything, the hard seasons and the good ones, the losses and the abundance. The Double Arrow had a year of drought in 1886 that required the kind of careful management that revealed who people were under pressure, and Graham Archer was exactly who he was in good years, steady and precise and without drama, making the hard decisions without complaint and taking care of his people through them. Frances kept the workroom operating through the drought year, and the income from it was not insignificant to the ranch's survival, a fact that Graham acknowledged plainly, and that she received the way she had learned to receive his honesty, as a form of love. They had a third child in 1887, a boy they named Thomas, who arrived in the spring and immediately distinguished himself by being the most physically energetic person currently residing at the Double Arrow, which was saying something given that Samuel was now 7 and Clara was 3. Thomas Archer spent his first 2 years covering maximum ground in minimum time, and his parents spent those 2 years keeping track of him with the shared efficiency of two people who had become very good at anticipating each other. Samuel turned 10 in 1890 and was already showing a serious interest in the legal and business aspects of ranch operations, which Graham encouraged by including him in certain conversations and by taking him along to Caldwell for the periodic meetings with the county land office that were still occasionally necessary. Frances watched Graham with Samuel during these trips and felt the full warmth of a woman seeing a man she loves be exactly the father she had hoped he would be, patient and direct, and treating Samuel as someone capable of understanding real things rather than a simplified version of them. Frances wrote a letter to Cornelius Whitfield in the spring of 1890, 12 years after she had left St. Louis. She had been composing it in her mind for those 12 years without knowing she was composing it, and one April morning she sat down at the desk in the workroom with good paper and a pen and wrote it out. She told him precisely what he had done and precisely what it had cost her. She told him that she had built a life that he would have recognized as successful by any standard he valued, which was true. She told him that she did not forgive him, which was also true, but that she had decided she was finished carrying his damage as a weight on her own future. She told him that she hoped he understood the nature of what he had done, not for her sake but for the sake of anyone who came after her in his path. She sent the letter. She did not receive a reply, which was exactly what she expected. But the act of sending it completed something in her that she had not realized was incomplete, a final step in the long process of separating the injury from the person it had been done to, of locating the damage fully in the person who had committed it rather than letting it continue to occupy space in her own chest. She told Graham she had sent the letter that evening on the porch in the April warmth with the nighthawks doing their precise evening work above the pasture. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "How do you feel?" "Finished with it," she said. "In a way I wasn't before." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "Good." She laughed, the full genuine laugh she had become accustomed to having in this life she had built, and he smiled in the way that was only for her, private and warm, and reached over and took her hand on the porch rail. And they sat like that in the April evening, with the children's voices coming from inside where Alina was managing the bedtime process with her characteristic competence, and the stars coming up one by one over the flat Kansas horizon, and the double arrow all around them. Solid and real, and built from years of honest work and honest love. Graham turned to look at her after a while in the way he had of suddenly needing to look at her directly, the way he had looked at her in the stable doorway when he said the words that had cracked her open, and he said, "I want to say something." "Say it," she said. "I've thought about that day in the stable," he said. "About what I said to you. I've thought about it because I wasn't sure afterward that I said the right thing. I wasn't sure it was what you needed." "It was exactly what I needed," she said. "I know that now," he said. "But I want to say more than I said then, because I had the words but not quite the fullness of them yet." He turned to face her fully, the way he had in the stable, the same river water directness, but with something behind it now that was 12 years of shared life rather than the beginning of knowing each other. "You were never the problem. Not in St. Louis. Not in Caldwell. Not anywhere. You walked into every room and offered them your actual self, which is an extraordinary thing to do when you've been taught to believe that your actual self is the thing that got you into trouble. And they couldn't receive it, most of them, because receiving someone as they actually are requires a generosity that most people are too frightened to practice. The problem was always theirs. It was never you." Frances Monroe Archer sat on the porch of the Double Arrow Ranch house in the spring of 1890, and heard the fullness of the words she had first heard in the stable 12 years ago, and felt them arrive in the place they had always been meant to reach, the deep interior place where the original damage had been done. She looked at her husband, this man who had found the hidden motive of kindness, and had made it the operating principle of everything he did, who had looked at her across a dress shop counter and seen her without the verdict that everyone else had already delivered, and she felt the truth of everything she had chosen settle into its final shape. "I know that," she said. "I know it now." "I know you do," he said. "I just needed you to hear me say it completely." She leaned her head against his shoulder in the April dark, and he rested his cheek against her hair, and the nighthawks turned above them in their ancient circuits. And inside the house, Alina was telling the children some story in Spanish that was making Samuel laugh, the full, unguarded laugh of a child who is safe. And Thomas was demanding a specific detail of the story be repeated, and Clara was providing what sounded like editorial commentary on the entire proceedings. The double arrow ran well into the next decade, with Samuel growing into a young man who did, in fact, combine his mother's precision with his father's patience in a way that made him an exceptional manager of both animals and accounts, and who began at 16 to take on genuine responsibility in the ranch's operations with the seriousness of someone who understood that responsibility was not a performance, but an actual thing requiring actual competence. Clara grew into the forceful and direct person she had always been, with an additional layer of thoughtfulness that had developed somewhere around age 12 and had surprised everyone, including Clara herself. And Thomas grew into the most physically competent person on the double arrow, with a gift for horses that even the most experienced ranch hand respected. Frances's workroom became something she had never originally intended it to be, which was a small school of craft, with a rotating roster of apprentices that over the years included women from Caldwell and from further away, women who were learning a skill that would give them options, women who needed the combination of work and community that the workroom provided. Frances did not think of herself as a teacher, but the women she trained thought of her as one, and they said so, and she eventually accepted the truth of it. Mildred Dawson retired from the dress shop in 1893 and sold the business to a young couple from Emporia, and Frances bought the inventory of specialty fabrics at the retirement sale and sent Mildred a gift of a dress she had made especially, in the deep teal color that suited Mildred best, which Mildred received with the full weight of feeling that she deserved. In the late summer of 1895, Frances and Graham Archer sat on the double arrow porch on a Sunday evening while Samuel, now 15, was at a friend's ranch for the weekend, and Clara, 11, was reading inside with the focused intensity she brought to books, and Thomas, 8, was in the stable doing his last check of the horses before bed with the elaborate ritualistic care he gave to everything involving horses. The summer evening was doing what Kansas summer evenings did, which was turning the whole western sky every possible shade of gold and rose and soft fire before the dark came, and the double arrow spread out around them in the last of the light, the buildings and the pastures and the cattle moving at the far end of the north field, all of it solid and real and completely theirs. "Do you remember the first time you came here?" Graham asked. "For coffee with Alina, before we were married." "I remember the curtains," she said. "I saw them in the windows and felt something settle." "I saw you arrive from the north pasture," he said. "I came in an hour later because I needed to give you the time to decide before I influenced the decision. You were giving me the choice," she said. "You needed to choose it without me standing there," he said. "I knew what I wanted. I needed you to know what you wanted." She looked at him, at the man who had understood from the beginning that what she needed most was not protection but respect for her own judgment. "I wanted it," she said. "I want it still." "So do I," he said. The stars came up the way they did over the Kansas plains, all at once and without ceremony, and the double arrow was quiet in the way of a place that is full of life temporarily stilled. And Frances Monroe Archer held her husband's hand on the porch rail and felt the full weight of the life she had chosen, the life she had built from the difficult materials of betrayal and secrets and dark history, and one man's honest eyes and her own refusal to be less than she was. She felt the weight of it, and it was not heavy. It was the good weight of something real and true and completely hers. Thomas came out of the stable and crossed the yard in the last light, walking in the direct line from the stable to the house that was already so characteristic of him that you could identify him from a distance just by the trajectory. And he looked up at the porch and said, with the particular Thomas tone that combined the matter-of-fact with the quietly dramatic, "The roan mare is going to have her foal tonight. I'm going to stay with her." Graham looked at Francis. Francis looked at Graham. "I'll come with you," Francis said to Thomas, getting up from her chair with the ease of a woman who had been getting up to deal with the important things of ranch life for 16 years and did not find it inconvenient. "Your father will stay available in case we need him." "Good," Graham Archer said, and Francis laughed again, and Thomas looked at both of them with the expression of a child who has learned that his parents are private and mysterious in ways he will not fully understand until he is older, and led his mother back across the yard to the stable in the last of the Kansas summer light. The roan mare produced a healthy foal before midnight, with Thomas present and Francis providing the calm, steadying influence she brought to everything, and the foal stood on uncertain legs in the lamplit stable, while Thomas Archer watched it with the complete, undisguised wonder of someone encountering a miracle he had been expecting, but which had not lost its power to astonish. And Francis watched her son watch the foal, and thought that this was what it was for, all of it. The long, difficult years of survival and the hard work of building and the daily practice of love. It was for this specific moment, this specific child's face turned toward a new life, finding its feet in the lamplight. And the knowledge that she had arrived, completely and without reservation, in exactly the right place. She walked back to the house in the deep of the Kansas night, under the brilliant specific weight of the stars, and Graham was on the porch waiting because he had been waiting the way he always waited, with the patience that was not resignation, but was the full, active confidence that she would come back. She came up the porch steps and he stood, and she walked into his arms and he held her, and the night was warm and full of the smell of the summer grass, and the sounds of the cattle settling, and somewhere the foal's first small, uncertain sounds carrying from the stable across the quiet yard. "Healthy foal," she said, into his shoulder. "Good," he said. "Graham Archer," she said, pulling back just far enough to look at him in the faint starlight, at the face she had been looking at for 16 years and which still had the power to stop her in her tracks. The silver now more than threads in the dark hair, but the river water eyes exactly as they had always been, clear and deep, and looking at her with the full attention that had been the first thing she loved about him before she knew she was loving anything. "You are the best thing I chose." He looked at her for a long moment in the starlight, with everything that had passed between them over the years alive in his expression, the stable and the dinner and the porch and the courtroom and the children and the drought year, and the letter to Whitfield, and all the ordinary and extraordinary days that had accumulated into a life. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the stable when he said the words that had broken her open and let the light in. "So did I," he said simply. "Every single day." The stars burned above the double arrow in their ancient, indifferent beauty, and Francis Monroe Archer and Graham Archer stood on their porch in the Kansas night, holding each other in the complete and ordinary peace of two people who had been through the fire of other people's cruelty and their own fear, and had come out the other side into something they had built themselves, from the ground up, with their own hands and their own truth and their own stubborn refusal to believe that they were what the world had tried to tell them they were. The night went on around them. The ranch breathed. The children slept. The foal found its legs in the lamplight stable, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the fullest and most honest sense of the word, everything.